The most brutal punishment practices at sea: keelhauling and flogging. Sailors practiced some cruel, torturous punishments on crew members who disobeyed the rules. Some of the punishments were called keelhauling and flogging. Neither of these punishments had the purpose of killing, but they were carried out so many times that it was considered very cruel just for a small mistake. Of course, it can kill if the captain of the ship wants to. The punishment was carried out in front of other crew members as a warning to them. People thought such forms of punishment were acceptable, as sailors had to work in obedience to their captain. William McNally wrote in his book that slaves were treated better than crew members. On this day, we will discuss the barbaric and vicious punishments that sailors used to discipline their crew members. But don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. Keelhauling was the most popular type of punishment at sea in the 17th and 18th centuries. At least in those years, various depictions of keelhauling were found. Its history dates back to the Greeks, around 700 before Christ, where the Greeks practiced it in the maritime waters of Rhodos. Various carvings on vases and other artifacts depict the practice of keelhauling. For after the offender was keelhauled, they would be given time to recover from the pain. The word keelhaul comes from the Dutch keelhaan, which means to pull down the keel of a ship. The purpose of this punishment was not to kill the offending crew, but to discipline them. The use of the term keelhauling is found in the records of English writers in the 17th century, but they used obscure and rare references. More concrete records of keelhauling were found in the Netherlands, where it was officially described how the punishment was carried out. An example is a painting by Leef Pieters, entitled The Keelhauling of the Ship's Surgeon of Admiral Jan van Ness from 1660 to 1686. The painting is now on display at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. The painting describes the process of keelhauling as a severe punishment whereby the condemned man was dragged beneath the ship's keel on a rope. It served as a terrible warning to all mariners. Then, in a book entitled Voyages to and Through the East Indies by Christophorus Friccius in 1680, mentions several practices of keelhauling in the 17th century. The practice of keelhauling was brutal, where the offending crew member was tied up and pulled onto the ship with his naked body, hands and feet bound with chains and cannonballs, so that they could not swim and drown. The offender would be dragged under the hull and to the other side, causing rubbing against the surface beneath the ship and sharp shells on the bottom. Two ropes tied across the bottom of the boat, and the mast pulled the offender's body, slamming it against the ship's hull. The faster the boat moves, the worse the injury. Sometimes an oil-soaked sponge was stuffed into the offenders' mouths to make it difficult for them to breathe in the water. Although the goal was to make them face as much suffering as possible and keep them alive, the captain would lift up the offender's body, examining the wounds they had received. If the wounds were still not enough, he would continue keelhauling. However, many offenders were also killed by keelhauling. Some bled out, lost their heads, drowned, or were eaten by sea creatures. Surviving offenders will be traumatized for the rest of their lives because of the torture they faced. The Dutch Navy was famous for its frequent keelhauling between 1560 and 1883. In 1652, a voyage under the command of Jan van Riebeeck committed 150 lashes and keelhaul to a crew member. After that, he was enslaved for 2 years. Cornelis Evertson the youngest also practiced the most horrific keelhauling on 2 sailors who committed murder in 1673. The Dutch officially banned it in 1750. The British Royal Navy also conducted keelhauling in the 16th and 17th centuries, mostly in the mid to 1880s. However, after 1860, the British abandoned the practice. Flogging punishment is usually carried out in various places such as in schools, armed forces, prisons, and even at home, with the aim of disciplining children, students, prisoners, or their subordinates. The method of beating varies. It can use whips, sticks, rods, ropes, or other objects. The Russian Empire used a similar punishment called the Russian Knockout in the 1860s. The whip used was made of raw leather straps that were dried until hardened, interspersed with sharpened wire until pointed. The deadly and painful punishment was abolished in 1845 because it was considered a political offense. Not only in the Russian Empire, but in England, the Whipping Act was introduced in 1530. The law authorized the beating of poachers, thieves, blasphemers, and even the insane, and those who committed minor offenses. Whipping was introduced while tying the punished person to the end of a cart. This punishment existed at least until the 1590s. In the 19th century, prisons restricted corporal punishment, so it was gradually replaced. Although courts still have the authority to order flogging for certain cases of crime and violence. The Criminal Justice Act of 1948 ended such corporal punishment in Wales, Scotland, and England, although the punishment still applied to seditionists, insurgents, and self-harming offenders in England and Wales until 1967. In the 18th century, flogging was imposed in the Netherlands and Denmark on German criminals who were out of town. In the 1920s, colony guards in France used horsewhips to punish prisoners. The definition of flog for sailors was a beating with a sharp nine-tailed whip that could tear the skin while tied to the ship's mast. To increase the pain, salt was poured over the wounds, causing the wounds to become infected. This punishment was often practiced by ship captains in the 19th century. The abolition of flogging in the United States faces a difficult journey, as it has been a punishment that has been passed down through generations in the United States Navy. Warnings of excessive flogging were first written by Captain Thomas Truxtun in 1797 and by Surgeon Edward Cutbush in 1808. In 1820, the abolition of flogging was first proposed to the United States Congress by Representative Samuel Foote, but his efforts were unsuccessful. In 1831, Secretary of the Navy Moore Woodbury recommended a policy of light punishment that Congress could apply to punishment in the Navy. For example, primarily with a mark of dishonor and a fine or other form of punishment lighter than the humiliating whipping. In response, Secretary of the Navy James K. Paulding issued a new order regarding flogging, namely that every time a flogging is carried out, it must be in accordance with the law and must be in the presence of the captain. Paulding's new order was praised by the New York Evening Star newspaper. With material from the Norfolk Herald about the arrival of the sloop of war Vandalia sailing to the Gulf of Mexico, the story of her voyage under the command of Captain Uriah P. Levy Herald is written. It tells of the ship's excellent condition without imposing flogging, substituting other punishments such as punishing 16 and 18-year-old boys accused of taunting an officer by tying them to a cannon with their pants down. He also ordered the insertion of tar, the size of a silver coin, to the size of a man's head with parrot feathers into the ass of punished crew members. This included the punishment of a mark of dishonor. The story of the punishments imposed by Captain Herald was considered by Lieutenant George Mason Who as shameful and inappropriate for an officer or man. Thereafter, the Evening Star newspaper edited and reprinted it without any comment in the January 1840 edition of the Army and Navy Chronicle magazine. Captain Herald was called to a court-martial because he opposed the flogging during his voyage. He was sentenced to discharge, but President John Tyler examined his case. He found that the punishment was humiliating, but the motive was good, neither injuring nor causing harm. Eventually, President Tyler reduced his sentence to a 12-month suspension. The punishment given to Captain Herald made other captains hesitant to change the flogging punishment, but Captain Herald continued to oppose the whip, writing his opinion in the newspaper about the abolition of the whip. Several other officers also opposed the whip law, such as Captains Lawrence Kearney, Robert F. Stockton, and John C. Long. The practice of flogging in the North is often associated with the treatment of slaves and convicts. In fact, it goes against the democratic ideals of the United States. William McNally in 1839 published his opinions in Evil Island abuses in the naval and merchant service during his time as a sailor. He argued that this practice of whipping discouraged American Indian men from working in the Navy, resulting in a labor shortage in the Navy. They became more dependent on hiring crew from other countries. Former sailors wrote their opinions about punishments at sea, especially flogging. In 1840, a book entitled Cruise of the Frigate Columbia Around the World by William M. Morrell was published. In his book, he recounted his experience of being flogged 12 times just for accidentally spilling ink on deck and mislabeling clothes. Other crew members were also flogged for forgetting to close the toilet door or not washing dirty pots. Morrell thinks flogging should be applied to more serious offenses such as theft. In the same year, Richard Henry Dana published the book 2 Years Before the Mast, which recounted his experiences as a crewman on the merchant ship Brig Pilgrim. He described the horrific flogging on the ship in 1839. Although he had witnessed it, he himself doubted the policy of abolishing flogging. In 1841, a former soldier named Solomon Sanborn distributed a pamphlet entitled An Exposition of Official Tyranny in the United States Navy. He gave various examples of officers' abuse of regulations and called for the abolition of the flogging. He also created an account of naval service and officers' abuse of power to support his efforts. the provision of grog or water-mixed whiskey also caused indiscipline problems. A faith-based organization, the American Seamen's Friend Society is at the forefront of the movement to abolish grog and whipping, including at sea. In the 1840s, civilians began pleading with Congress to abolish whipping. The whip abolition movement was promoted by an anti-slavery senator, John P. Hale, in 1847. When he had served as a member of the House of Representatives from New Hampshire, he introduced amendments to the law abolishing whipping in the Navy in 1844 and 1845. In Washington, he announced his intention to abolish whipping to the Senate. Between December 1949 and June 1850, the Senate received 271 petitions from citizens urging abolition. Later in 1850, the Secretary of the Navy gathered naval officers to solicit their opinions regarding the abolition of whips and grog without negatively impacting the Navy and other merchant fleets. Out of 84 responses, only 7 officers thought both should be abolished and discontinued. Despite being outnumbered, Senator Hale managed to pass a bill abolishing whipping in the Navy and merchant fleet in September 1850. Some naval officers thought his legislation was misguided. In March 1850, Herman Melville's novel White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, was published. In several chapters of the book, he discussed the negative effects and abuses of flogging. Some naval officers disagreed with Melville's statements. They wrote rebuttals in pamphlets and newspapers. The effort died down after a senator from New Jersey and former Navy captain named Robert F. Stockton made a speech. He said that naval officers should be able to adjust to the new conditions, especially after Congress was under pressure to pass the law. Finally, in March 1855, Congress passed legislation for a more streamlined court-martial system with lesser offenses to discipline crew members. These courts could impose sentences of solitary confinement, water and bread fasting for a set period of time, and even discharge for misbehavior. In 1862, Congress revised various legal powers and Navy regulations to reflect more disciplined and progressive behavior.